I'm joined by CNN Politics senior reporter Stephen Collinson and our global affairs analyst Kim Dozier. And there he was, of course, referring to Ukraine. First, how do you both read? Let's start with Donald Trump's comments there, blaming Ukraine for the conflict in Ukraine.
Well, Becky, I think that what's happened is the United States has switched from taking the position of the invaded country to supporting the invader. I don't think there's any other way to read these comments by President Trump. He seems to be trying to push Zelensky off the scene by saying that he should hold elections. And I think this will go down very poorly in Europe, which is trying, I think, at least to come up with an alternative plan, because it looks like the United States has firmly taken the side of Russia in these negotiations. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is coming to the US next week to try to perhaps keep Donald Trump in the tent, if you like. It seems that his task is going to be extraordinarily difficult after these remarks by the president.
Yeah, and the Europeans certainly back up against the wall at present. Kim, how do you read what Zelensky said in response to Donald Trump? We played part of it. He literally directly responded to a bunch of things that Donald Trump said, which were blatantly untrue.
Yeah, Zelensky says that Trump is spouting Russian disinformation. Spouting is my word, Russian disinformation, he specifically mentions, and that is similar to what I've been hearing from European and Ukrainian officials this morning, they are gobsmacked. They are shocked, and as one politician told me, she's pissed, because they really thought that the Trump administration would come in and level the playing field. They had hoped it would be like other Republican administrations that were seen as sort of strongman administrations and able to make deals that the Democrats weren't. But instead, while they've liked what they've heard from retired General Keith Kellogg, the Trump envoy to Ukraine, what they've heard out of the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and now, most importantly, again and again from Donald Trump, has them worried. One of the things that they really take issue with is that Trump has said Zelensky has a 4% approval rating, and that is specifically out of Russian disinformation channels, Ukrainians say, whereas the most recent polls I could find have them somewhere around 50 to 52%. And even this morning, a poll was released.
Which is around about what Donald Trump is polling at, of course. Yes. Kim, can I just stop you for a moment? I do, forgive me. President Putin is speaking in Moscow. We've got translation. We just want to listen in.
They didn't have anti-aircraft weaponry at that site. So it's not really a Russian facility. It's an international energy facility. It's American companies, Chevron, I think, and European ones as well, Enel, as well as Russian, in the Caspian, and the money we get from it is 5 kopecks, doesn't. So it's not just that we are providing services to our Kazakh friends, but also to those partners working in Kazakhstan. And the oil that they get essentially is ours. It's shared between the American and the other European companies, of course. I wouldn't say it's a critical kind of volume, but it is a volume on the, it is a good amount on the international market. And this will have an effect on the international energy market, certainly. First and foremost, because, unfortunately, it's very difficult to restore it very quickly. Because mainly there's Western equipment involved, and this Western equipment was damaged. So just like to say that the Western countries extended the sanctions on Russia to such an extent that we can't get spare parts for oil and gas extraction. Which means that the Ukrainian forces actually struck a station which the West afterwards say they can't restore because, as I said, the main equipment belongs to the German company Siemens. If it could be restored tomorrow or the day after, why would they say it will take months? Obviously, if you look at this sort of formally, you can see a kind of uncoordinated action. Maybe it was just an accident because the Europeans are going their way and not paying attention to it. But if you look at it otherwise, it's a strike against us. Why was that necessary? Because it's absurd, because it will affect the prices on the international market. And the administration, the U.S. administration, always said that it's trying to stabilize oil prices. But this is really counterproductive. Yesterday, the consortium had a meeting on this issue, and they're going to decide what to do now. It's not so much a problem for us as for the investor countries. Thank you.
So President Putin there just addressing reporters' questions on what has been this attack on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. He has said that it is impossible to restore quickly because Western equipment was damaged. Now this, let me just explain, the pipeline moves Kazakhstan oil to world markets and has been reduced by about 30 to 40% after a drone attack at a pumping station in southern Russia, a drone attack that the Russians, of course, blame on Ukraine. That's the very latest from St. Petersburg, where we wanted you to just hear from President Putin. Of course, he's clearly front and centre in the news cycle at present, given the talks yesterday in Riyadh between the US and Russia and comments in the last 24 hours from the US president that the Ukraine war is the Ukrainians are to blame for the Ukraine war. Look, I've got Kim and Stephen still with me. Guys, thank you for standing by. And Kim, apologies for jumping in on you. We didn't want to miss anything strategic or important from Putin there. I'm not sure that we had anything that we further want to discuss apart from that which I've just suggested. Look, let's hear from the Russians, both of you. Here's how Foreign Minister Lavrov is describing what's happened between his boss, Vladimir Putin, and the US President Donald Trump. Have a listen.
I'd just like to point out that the strivings of the collective West remain in a privileged position and in a dominant world, although they have started to dialogue with us. They are being very selective in their interpretation of the international legal documents. And, of course, Ukraine is a case in point.
You talked about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. having sort of discussed the root causes of the conflict. I just wonder, to your mind, will Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have agreed on the root causes at this point? Does it appear to you from what we are hearing from Donald Trump that indeed they have?
Well, Trump values a person-to-person relationship, and he's obviously had a long conversation with Putin and absorbed much of what he heard, because he has this habit of respecting those who don't need something from him, as opposed to countries like Europe, et cetera, who are allies who do need something from the United States. So he's lapped that up, apparently, from what we're hearing from him. But I'm thinking of his national security team. Secretary of State Rubio has always been tough on Russia, and the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, was the Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney under Bush, when Russia betrayed Bush and Cheney by the surprise invasion of Georgia. So Waltz has some scar tissue. Rubio's very aware of that history too. So they're going to have to try to convince Trump that he doesn't want to absorb everything. He can't take everything that Putin tells him at face value. So I'm sure there's this careful program to try to walk that back. And I think that also the main negotiator that has been brought into this, the real estate magnate that Trump has brought on, who's a friend, he knows if a deal is good or bad. So I'm hoping that he will come from a different direction and say to Trump, look, you're getting manipulated. You don't want to get rolled. We don't want to let Russia or anyone have the best of us.
It's interesting. Boris Johnson today suggesting in an X post that Donald Trump's statements are not intended to be historically accurate, but to shock Europeans into action. And I want to talk to you very specifically, Stephen, about the European response to all of this. Before I do that, though, CNN's Nick Payne-Walsh is in Kyiv. I want to get to him specifically now. Donald Trump's man, Keith Kellogg, says he is in Kyiv to listen, and we quote him there. What's the message Zelensky is likely to deliver via Keith Kellogg today? Nick?
Yeah, I mean, we asked Zelensky directly if indeed, as the security guarantees that Kellogg mentioned to me this morning as he got off the train, were going to be part of their conversation. And indeed, while Kellogg is here to listen as well, what for Zelensky would work as a security guarantee if indeed being a member of NATO isn't going to happen, if US troops here isn't going to happen. And Zelensky gave to me an impassioned statement about the need for urgent air defences to be delivered to Ukraine. Nightly here, ballistic missiles, drones in their dozens attacking Ukraine's cities. We heard them intensely over Kiev just last night. They are running out, it seems, day by day of specific interceptors for these higher end Russian ballistic missiles. He sort of said, look, if it's possible for the Middle East to have these items, then why can't we have them? We're at war indeed right now. And so a passion plea there, certainly. But I think there is a lot of questions being asked at this point about the role Kellogg plays in these negotiations. A lot certainly has been done prior to his first visit here. The US-Russia summit in Riyadh, leaving, I think, potentially some in Ukraine anxious that we're seeing a Moscow-Washington rapprochement here on the table first up. The peace in Ukraine being potentially part of that, but not necessarily the full deal. And certainly the comments from last night in the Oval Office have left many deeply worried that we are simply hearing Trump repeating things he's heard from the Kremlin head. But also, too, Zelensky speaking about how this summit in Riyadh had broken the isolation for Putin we've seen recently. And I think that it marks a change today. We're hearing, I think, a much more strident Zelensky in defence of Ukraine's position, his own polling ratings, and clear that he wanted to contradict what he'd heard from the White House head just last night.
Yeah, and of course, Donald Trump suggesting Zelensky's ratings are some 4%, which, as I understand it, is one of the Kremlin's talking points, as is the idea that any deal for Ukraine would mean Zelensky signing up to new elections at this point. Let's just have a listen.
We're hearing that Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, or essentially martial law in Ukraine. The people of Ukraine have to say, like, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me.
This, of course, is a country undergoing a violent invasion, and perhaps the reason why there hasn't been any elections of late. But how realistic would elections be at this moment in Ukraine, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a exceptionally dangerous thing potentially to introduce here. We've been speaking to people over the past couple of days about the sheer act of just putting an election together. Remember, the last 20 years, Russia has interfered enormously in pretty much every electoral process it can, causing protests back in 2003 and 4 to try and change an event that had clearly been doctored in Russia's interests. And so the idea here of trying to do a lot of the electoral reform that would be required to make a transparent, valid international process, while at the same time being at war, dealing with the likelihood of Russian malfeasance and disinformation here as well, and then also dealing with the issue of what do you do with the voters of Ukrainian who now live abroad, what do you do with the million-plus men and women in uniform fighting on the front line, how do you get all these people to polling stations, even if you have a ceasefire. The point made by Zelensky's team is that this is essentially about trying to disrupt and sap the combat readiness of the Ukrainian military, even if a ceasefire is called, to allow Russia potentially a gap. And then, look, let's face it, most likely introduce some kind of electoral process, the result of which is going to leave some people unhappy, be the international monitors, be the opposition politicians here, be they people who don't consider the outcome to necessarily have been in their favour. Will it increase the sense of question marks over whoever wins that election? And I think ultimately this is, as people have said, a bid by Russia to introduce doubt into the legitimacy of Zelensky. It's martial law. He doesn't need to introduce elections at this point. It has come round in the past over previous years and been pushed back because his poll rating has been quite solid. I think that was the point he was trying to make again today. But the notion of elections here, I think, that would be pretty much catastrophic, I think, for government integrity. Most people recognise that. Becky?
Yeah, ironically, he was suggesting that his poll ratings are just above 50%, just about the same as they are, of course, for Donald Trump at present in the latest polls. Thank you, Nick. Stephen, let me bring you back in. In your analysis, you make the point, quote, the US president's comments will fuel fresh fears in Europe, which has also was also excluded from those US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia, that Trump will try to impose a peace deal in Ukraine that favours his friend in the Kremlin. His remarks also appeared to directly contradict assurances by his own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. I quoted Boris Johnson just earlier on as we started this, suggesting that Trump's statements are not intended to be entirely accurate, but to shock Europeans into action. Boris Johnson's position, the former Prime Minister of the UK, not mine. Just how impactful, though, do you see what appears to be this mixed messaging from the Trump administration itself to the world, and very specifically to the Europeans at this point?
Well, to Boris Johnson's point, I don't really share the view that Trump is playing some kind of very intricate diplomatic game. I think what he says and what comes out of his mouth is exactly what he thinks. His position on Ukraine is not an isolated one in the United States. The MAGA movement wants to wash its hands completely out of Ukraine. So he's saying something that's very popular amongst his followers. I do find it kind of surprising that the Europeans were so shocked about Trump's positioning over the last few weeks. If you listen to what he said on the campaign, I think it was pretty obvious about how he was going to proceed. There was a sense among diplomats in Washington before the election. They were saying, well, we know what a second Trump would look like. We will be able to handle it. It seems to me that Trump is a much more hardline president in his second term in terms of foreign policy than his first. He intends to push forward a more authentic sense of his own goals, I think, than he did in the first term when he was surrounded by more establishment foreign policy advisors. So I think we should listen to what Trump says, and the Europeans are going to have a problem. They're saying that some of them are willing to put forces into Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. That would require substantial US intelligence and air assets. And the question that Trump hasn't answered is whether he'd be prepared to do that.
You make some very good points, as ever, Stephen, and there are many who echo your thoughts about why it is that the Europeans are so sort of wrong-footed at this point. Obviously, over the last weekend, a very sort of finger-pointing speech made by the vice president at the Munich Security Council, which I know, unnerved many. But the idea, Kim, that people are surprised to hear this, very forceful position from the US president, perhaps is slightly misguided, ultimately. We've seen European leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron calling for more security independence. To give him his due, he's been talking about a European security sort of pact for a long time now. Ursula von der Leyen posting in recent days, Europe's security is at a turning point. We need an urgency mindset. I just wonder how much substance there is to that, or there was to that, perhaps more so now. Do you now see a sense of urgency from the Europeans?
Well, this ice bath of rhetoric that Europe just got in the face from a multitude of Trump administration officials has already produced one concrete result, in that after months of talking about it behind closed doors, I talked to one European leader who said, we're all talking about the possibility of putting troops in Ukraine for peacekeeping, for training, maybe even before that, but no one will say it out loud. Well, the British Prime Minister, as Steve mentioned, just said it. So this could be the thing that after years of discussions, like you hear from weapons manufacturers in Europe who say, the European leaders keep talking about ramping up, but then they don't send us any orders. Well, maybe that's all about to change. I know that European weapons stocks have been spiking over the past few days. And European officials I hear from are saying, okay, well, now we've got the worst possible outcome that we expected. We haven't had a deal made, but it looks like it's going in a wrong direction. And we finally have to get off the X and do something.
It's good to have you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, regular guests on this show, and I'm sure we will be speaking very soon. It's busy times.